The GPS DairyCAST features the high-value insights of the GPS Dairy Consulting team's trusted advisors and the owners and managers from the elite dairy farms they serve. These conversations deliver on the GPS Dairy Consulting promise to inspire change and grow leaders.
Hello and welcome to the GPS DairyCAST. I'm Peggy Coffeen from the Up-Level Dairy Podcast, serving as your host. And on this GPS DairyCAST, we are coming to you from the 2024 GPS Leaders Forum. And joining me for this episode are GPS team member Megan Abeyta, as well as featured speaker Mike Rankin. You're going to hear about the future of forages as Megan and Mike recap his presentation, Crystal Balling Forages and the Dairy Ration. Enjoy this conversation with Megan and Mike here on the GPS DairyCAST.
All right, Mike. Well, thank you for being here. We're really excited to have you share your expertise in this world of forages, and we're really grateful that you came here to spend time talking about your expertise. So you covered a lot of different topics about the future of forages. I'm curious what your expectations are in regards to new forages or how they're going to improve in the future or where you think that's going to head.
Sure. Well, thanks for asking me over here, Megan. I mean, as we look at forage crops, we've had forage crops since the beginning of mankind and figured out ways to use them. And by now, we pretty much know what we have to work with. So I don't anticipate there's going to be any new crop that's going to take the country by rage. I think most of the changes that we'll see will be changes in terms of making what we have better or learning to manage what we have better. So that's overall where I think we'll be with forage crops going into the future. And we feed ruminants, and ruminants have to have some level of forage in their diet, always have, always will, need to. And so forages are always going to be a part of the dairy landscape. I don't think that's going to change.
Yeah. Actually, during your talk, you made some interesting points about defining corn silage as a forage itself. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Oh, yeah. I just find it ironic sometimes, and I do it too. Everybody does it. We call corn silage a forage, when in fact, half of that is grain. So sometimes what we think is a high forage diet because we have a lot of corn silage inclusion in there. When you really figure out what that percent forage is, it's oftentimes much less, into a range where I certainly wouldn't consider it a high forage diet. But, and again, that's not to say that's right or wrong. It's just a reality, and I don't think it's one that we often recognize.
Absolutely. So what do you think is the future of BMR going forward? I know a lot of producers have grown it in the past. Some have gone away from it. Do you have any perspectives as to where that's going to go in the future?
Well, only from what I hear. There's been changes in the whole commercial BMR business, in that with the merger of Corteva and now Brevant Seeds, which used to be a company that produced a lot of BMR hybrids and still is. But I think the difference we see now is that the two breeding programs are basically combined into one and feeding kind of both companies. So I'm not sure what impact that will necessarily have. I only hear through the industry grapevine that sales of BMR have come down quite a bit. And so, looking into the future, who knows what's going to happen. My personal experience is, as I get out on farms across the country, is that people that either love BMRs or want nothing to do with the BMR. We know that you get the best benefit from BMRs when they're fed on the front end of the lactation, obviously, and very little benefit when fed on the tail end of the lactation. So that oftentimes requires that a separate storage unit be dedicated, whether that's a separate pile, a separate bag, whether that's a bunker silo. And as dairies get larger, that becomes more problematic. And so it's just easier to have a dedicated corn silage pile and a dedicated haylage pile, or you have to mix the BMR in with your standard hybrids, and then that just depreciates its value. So as to the future, I don't know. We only know that sales now have started to decline a little bit.
Yeah, and you also touched on short corn a little bit. I'm curious what the research is saying about yield. I also am curious about genetic traits that short corn can have. Does it have the same disease resistance as other hybrids? What are you seeing as the pros and cons of that particular approach?
Yeah, short corn is kind of interesting, and it's probably going to be the new big next thing. These are hybrids that are maybe 3 to 4 feet shorter than a standard corn hybrid would be. And the reason is to kind of defend against these high wind events and then have lodging and have those nightmare harvest falls where it's all laying down on the ground. So there's a couple companies, at least a couple, working on these shorter, reduced stature hybrids, whatever you want to call them. And basically, the way it works is these hybrids have a thicker stalk, so they have more pith versus rind. They have the same number of leaves as a standard conventional hybrid would, and the big difference is that the internodes are shorter between the leaf whorls. So in some cases, they're only shorter below the ear leaf. In some cases, they're uniformly shorter for the entire height of the plant. And of course, their ear set's lower than what a normal one would be. So these initial hybrids are really not on the market here in the U.S. a whole lot yet, other than some testing that's being done by these companies. I think they are on the market in Europe. And of course, the early ones will be more geared and bred for grain yields that'll match conventional corn, which they'll have to do. Otherwise, nobody's going to buy them. I'm not sure how much effort to date has been put into actually really fine-tuning or designing silage hybrids out of these, but what I have seen and heard in terms of people that have generated some silage data with these is that they're actually very comparable to conventional hybrids, and in some cases higher in quality. So we'll see. I mean, I think down the road we'll see with these short-statured hybrids that I'm sure there'll be efforts to make designer silage hybrids like we have with conventionals. And really with conventionals, we haven't been doing that all that long, really only 25 years or so, that maybe a little longer now that we've had a lot of effort in putting together hybrids specifically for silage and with silage traits. So I think the short-statured hybrids will be an interesting watch over the next few years.
Yeah, interesting. How about the future of haylage? Is there anything going on there?
Well, with alfalfa, yeah, there's nothing like short-statured alfalfa coming out or anything like that. And I think we'll continue to see with alfalfa traits incorporated that will help against stress events like drought or extreme heat. And we'll also see efforts toward longer persistence and those kinds of things. What we probably will not see ever again is a transgenic trait such as Roundup Ready alfalfa or Harvextra. The companies just find that it's too expensive to go through the regulatory hurdles that they have to go through to get those to market. And when you have a smaller market and a seed that you only sell once every 4 or 5 years versus with corn, you're selling seed every year, it's a little different game. Now, having said that, I think there are other breeding methods that are used that wouldn't require that regulatory rigor. So we may see some new improved quality traits. One thing that has been worked on for a while now and just hasn't come to fruition is a trait that would help protect more of alfalfa's protein in the rumen and digestive tract, and that would be a huge benefit for dairy farmers and for society as a whole, because that would not only offer better utilization of protein, but also less emissions in terms of what's coming out the back end. So I know scientists are working on that problem, and so hopefully down the road we get that solved. It just probably won't be solved with a transgenic trait.
Sure.
Otherwise, for alfalfa, a lot of the newer work has just been in new approaches to management and trying to determine, and when I say new approaches to management, things like establishing alfalfa under corn as a companion crop, and the corn can be chopped off, and then you basically have an alfalfa crop that's ready to go that next year. I've also seen more interest in seeding alfalfa, say, into winter rye in the spring. Anything that can double up. I mean, one of the issues with alfalfa in that seeding year is simply that you don't get that much yield, and that's a drawback. And we're seeing studies like from Michigan State on, they're trying to solve the whole autotoxicity problem of how long do you have to wait between seeding alfalfa and terminating a previous stand. So it's all very interesting, but nothing for sure yet.
The GPS Dairy Consulting team is growing and is looking for people that can be a part of the journey. A successful GPS Dairy Consultant is someone that is self-driven and loves to learn. It's an individual with a progressive mindset and one that is very entrepreneurial. Most importantly, GPS Dairy Consultants believe in teamwork and supporting one another. Does this sound like you? Collaboration is the business's horsepower, and it's the reason behind the success of our consultants. To learn more about joining GPS Dairy Consulting LLC, talk to any GPS consultant. Visit gpsdairy.com or email our team directly to contact@gpsdairy.com.
You also had touched on some interesting stuff with cocktail mixes of grasses and then different effects of region on how the quality of these grasses are for a particular, for dairy feeds.
I think grasses in general have had a renewed interest in incorporating them into different crop rotations or forage systems. Probably the most obvious one is seeding a little grass with your alfalfa. This has been a common practice, say, in the Northeast. I think I see it more now in the Midwest than I used to. And grasses are a great dairy forage, but they have to be cut on time. The thing about grasses is once they head out in the spring, their quality declines really quickly. So finding that grass that matches the alfalfa maturity has always been a bit of an issue. And then establishing these grasses with alfalfa is also kind of an issue from the standpoint that how much grass you actually get depends on the kind of weather and environment you've got when you seed it. So you can seed exactly the same amount of seed for 5 years and come up with very different amounts of grass in your alfalfa stand just based on, say, how much moisture you had at the time of seeding. Now, some of that isn't a real big deal, just from the standpoint that you don't need that much grass to really make it effective. And grasses are higher in NDF digestibility, and that's, I think, why a lot of nutritionists like a little bit of grass in the dairy ration. And say recently, in the last 5 to 8 years, meadow fescue. There's a grass that's been around for years and years and years. And all of a sudden, we've discovered, hey, this grass really works well in alfalfa mixtures from the standpoint of quality. It's a very high-quality grass, but it also persists well and lines up really well with alfalfa cutting schedules. So you never know when something like that will come to be discovered, but not a new grass, but a new grass in terms of how it's being used now, for sure. And perennial grasses in general, all of them can offer, again, really, really excellent quality if they're cut right. What I always used to debate is, well, should I be mixing it with my alfalfa, or should I just grow a pure stand of grass and harvest that and store it separately so that I know I can put in this much grass in my TMR, the same level every day of the year. There's upsides and downsides. Again, with all these grasses or other types of forages, you've always got to be thinking about storage and how am I going to store these separate. It's kind of like with the BMR corn. Every different type demands a separate storage unit or pile or whatever it might be. So you always want to think about that first before you start. Annual grasses have become really popular, and I see them from one coast to the other. Winter annuals like winter rye or triticale have become real common. Of course, I think the cover crop craze has kind of brought light to those as well. And so we oftentimes see those being planted after corn silage harvest, taken off in the spring, and then either fed to heifers or dry cows, or if it's high enough quality, it can certainly be fed to lactating animals as well. The challenge with those is they have a very narrow window to get high quality forage out of them. So sometimes that's 3 days. But once they start to head, just like I was talking about earlier with other perennial grasses, their quality really starts to decline. And so if you're looking for high quality winter annual forage, rylage, triticale, whatever, you really want to be on top of that come spring to get those off. But they have become widely used in the dairy industry, and I do get to areas like California where you see a lot more wheat being grown in that regard, but it just depends what part of the country you're in as to which one you might want to use.
Sure. You touched on how nutritionists love consistency, right?
Yes, they do. They love their corn silage, don't
yes.
they?
Comments were made about cocktail mixes and how that might change the percentage of what particular grass is in that harvest with each cutting. And could you elaborate a little bit on some of that?
Yeah, of course, one of the knocks on alfalfa has always been, it's not quite as consistent from cutting to cutting as, say, corn silage would be, which can be true. But cocktail mixes, again, have in recent years enjoyed a lot more use. And these are mixes of various types of annual forages. Usually they contain something like sorghum Sudan grass and ryegrass. There'll usually be a legume in there like red clover or white clover or ladino clover or hairy vetch or something like that, and maybe a brassica. Hence the name cocktail mixes, a mix of a lot of different annual forages. And I have, been on farms where they had trouble keeping alfalfa stands in, and they were looking for a way to kind of get around having to grow alfalfa. And if that was the case, they looked at these as kind of an alternative, with maybe growing corn for silage, coming in with winter rye, and then planting these cocktail mixes. And they can be planted a little later, certainly, and use those as their alternate forage source to, say, corn silage. But one of the problems with these mixes, or at least a reality, is that it seems that the different species kind of flourish at different cuttings. So your first cutting, you might have a whole lot of sorghum Sudan grass and a little bit of everything else. Second cutting, you might have a whole lot of ryegrass and a little bit of everything else. And then as you get into late summer, you might, in cooler weather with some rain, you might find that red clover is predominant. So from a consistency cutting to cutting standpoint, you have to figure out a way to manage that, whether that's layering it into a pile or bunker, or however you're going to handle it, putting each one in a different silage bag, or going to bailage, or whatever the case might be. But that is the reality if you're thinking about going to those mixes.
So Mike, just some final thoughts. Thanks again for being here today. But given the weather conditions of this last fall, how do you think producers should be preparing for this next spring in their fields?
Yeah, well, 2024 was really a unique year in a lot of areas, especially here in the Midwest. We had a really wet spring, a really wet June, and then somewhere along the line in summer, the rains just totally shut down, and it got much drier. And so what that leaves us with are a couple things. First of all, there was a lot of damage done to alfalfa stands in the spring where, they were looking for a window to get out there, and they had a little window, even though the soils were really still pretty wet, and just sacrificed some wheel track damage for getting that crop off. So I think from an alfalfa standpoint, if you want to get out there this spring and really take a look at some of these stands to see how much damage actually has occurred, and if you might need to maybe tear some of those stands up and reseed. And then, again, the flip occurred later in the year where it just got dry, and that enabled us to harvest some really high quality alfalfa, but just the yields were much, much lower. And I think for the most part, corn silage was pretty easy to get off. It was tough getting some of that planted for sure because of all that moisture in some areas. But I think the cornfields, for the most part, were really dry when those got harvested. So that actually would be an advantage in terms of compaction and that. So every year is something different, it seems. But the important thing is to know if you've got a problem before it's too late. So I just encourage growers to get out in those fields and walk around come spring and see what we have.
Great. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. And we've really enjoyed talking with you and hearing about everything you have to say about the future of forages in the dairy industry. So.
All right. Thanks for having me, Megan.
Thank you.
You just heard from Megan Abeyta from the GPS team, as well as Mike Rankin on the future of forages and the dairy cow ration. Thank you for jumping on with us for this GPS DairyCast. I'm your GPS DairyCast host, Peggy Coffeen from the Up Level Dairy Podcast, and thanks for listening with us today.
The GPS DairyCast features conversations that deliver on the GPS Dairy Consulting promise to inspire change and grow leaders. If this GPS DairyCast has you looking for more ways to become an elite dairy producer, find more information in our show notes on how you can add a GPS advisor to your team.